We have much to do today. I'm just so grateful for all of you enduring the security that was necessary today, and all those from the Washington Post and Voice of America, because we really need all of you to let the world know about this international security threats that we are enduring at this point in time. So I welcome all of you. I want to thank Senator Shaheen's staff, Daisy, for making this room available, and our partners, the McCain Institute and New America. This August, actually next month, will be the 10th anniversary of Jim's murder, and his murder and that of 6 innocent Americans that followed in the next 6 months was really a moral awakening for our country, because finally our country realized, gee, we need to do something about innocent Americans who are targeted simply because they're US nationals. So it was in actually September 4th of 2014 when the Foley Foundation started to prioritize freedom for US nationals who are targeted and taken hostage abroad, and to prioritize their return, promote journalist safety, and deter the horror of international hostage taking. So I just want to thank you all for being here today, and particularly our wonderful panel. I'm particularly grateful for our researcher, Cindy Lurcher, who's been working with the Foley Foundation since 2019. And she has helped us to begin to gather more and more evidence, speaking with hostage and wrongful detainee families, so that we can help our US fledgling enterprise, which started in 2015, become more and more effective at actually bringing Americans home and deterring hostage taking. So we thank you. We're so grateful. And I'm very grateful to have Peter Bergen here from New America, who's been our friend and colleague, talented journalist who will help bring out the stories of our brave panelists. We have Jonathan Dekel-Chen, father of Sagi, who is still being held by Hamas in Gaza. And we have Pavel Butorin, who's here on behalf of his lovely wife, Alsu Kurmasheva, who is being held in Russia. And we're delighted to have Dustin Stewart here, who is the new Deputy Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs. He's Roger Carsten's right hand. We're delighted to have him here. And very grateful to the McCain Institute for co-hosting this with us. We welcome you all. Pedro, please.
Thank you, Diane. We are humbled that you would choose to partner with us. We stand in admiration of you, Diane Foley, and everyone at the Foley Foundation for all you have done to turn tragedy into purpose. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pedro Pisano. I work at the McCain Institute. We strive to carry forth the legacy of Senator McCain for a safe, free, and just world. The McCain Institute is privileged to partner today with the Foley Foundation and New America for the release of the Foley Foundation's 6th annual report, Bringing Americans Home. There is really no other organization and no other report that captures the plight of Americans that are held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad so well. There are currently 46 of them, 46 lives, 46 families whose families haven't come home. How do I know that? I looked at the Foley Foundation website. These reports capture the plight of the hostage and their families with such thoughtfulness and care. They also provide clear and actionable recommendations to the US government and stakeholders. And they're also effective. Most of these recommendations have been actually enacted into law or put into practice. So how lucky today that we are here today to hear from the author herself, from formerly held hostages, from people who work on bringing them home, and from the families of current and former hostages. We know that fighting for the freedom of those wrongfully detained or held hostage abroad means the world to them. There's nothing more painful for a detainee to think that he or she has been forgotten. So we stand here today saying that we do not forget any American wrongfully held hostage abroad, and that we will keep you and your stories alive, so help us God, until you come home. Thank you very much. Cindy?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for a very kind introduction. Peter, it's very nice to meet you in person finally, instead of over many phone calls. So, very nice to meet you. And thank you, Diane, for a very kind introduction. Thank you for joining us, and especially want to give a special thanks to Peter Bergen for moderating, again, this important panel, and for all the panelists and for everyone that has joined us here and online as well. So before I get into talk, I just want to kind of frame things a little bit. I'll be providing background on the Foley reports, as well as a little bit of how our U.S. hostage policy has shaped things, and then get into the interesting findings as well. Not all of them, as hopefully you read the report, which would be great. But to date, the Foley Foundation has published 6 consecutive Bringing Americans Home reports. Each aims to stimulate discussions and to enhance the U.S. government's support for hostages, wrongful detainees, and their families. Overall, the 6 reports encompass or comprise of 300 interviews, and just initial interviews. And those interviews are predominantly with hostage families, former hostages, and former wrongful detainees, as well as folks within the academic space, U.S. government, specifically the Departments of State and Defense, the White House, and the intelligence communities. Each Bringing Americans Home report, it assesses the efficacy of the U.S. hostage policy, which is outlined in Presidential Policy Directive 30, known as PPD 30, and was put into effect in June of 2015. So PPD 30 really structured the way the U.S. government handled hostage takings, with a particular focus on enhancing and support for the families. Previously, the previous policy was entirely classified, and there was no family support. Out of PPD 30, we have structural changes. We have the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which is an interagency housed within the FBI. We also have the Special Presidential Envoy's Office for Hostage Affairs at the State Department, and the Hostage Response Group that's at the White House. So these are the 3 broad main structures that are aimed to ensure that the government can better coordinate as well as rapidly respond to any sort of hostage-taking situation. Since the implementation of PPD 30, we've had significant strides. In late December of 2020, the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act was codified late December 2020. In addition, we've had significant milestones for fiscal year 2024. The National Defense Authorization Act mandated provision for travel funding for families, specifically for wrongful detainee families, to match hostage families so they can come to Washington, D.C. and advocate for their loved ones. Most recently, the Stop Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act, which was introduced late last year, only introduced, and that was to amend the IRS code from 1986 to postpone tax deadlines or any fees that hostages and wrongful detainees are expected to pay. And it addresses a real significant issue for returned hostages and wrongful detainees because once they're released, the IRS holds them responsible for any missed payments, any missed taxes, and the fines and everything that's incurred afterwards. So very important to support this. The executive branch action has continued as well. In July 2022, President Biden issued Executive Order 14078 to both strengthen efforts to bring American hostages and wrongful detainees home, but also to address the wrongful detainees who were omitted from the PPD 30 policy in 2015. In addition, the executive order expanded the range of tools to allow the United States to deter and disrupt hostage-taking and wrongful detentions. They introduce this through different measures to impose costs on hostage takers and individuals responsible for holding Americans captive for their own financial, political, or other gains. While these improvements are, to the hostage enterprise are very, very important, more work must be done. Hostage taking and wrongful detentions are an evolving and enduring threat to the United States national security, foreign policy, and economy, as well as to the safety and security of our citizens. The Bringing Americans Home report aimed to maintain focus on this critical issue and make recommendations through its finding to further enhance the hostage enterprise. The report that we're here to discuss today is really focused on 3 areas. The first being the hostage and wrongful detainee landscape. It's an analytical, it's a quantitative analysis of an overview of the instances of hostage taking and wrongful detentions over time, going back to 2001, but we also focus from 2003 to 24 to focus for what's current. And also we discussed the perspectives of the U.S. government's hostage enterprise through the perspective of family members, former hostages and former wrongful detainees, as well as current cases of family members where their loved ones are currently being held. We do, in those cases, predominantly or 90% of those interviews are conducted with hostage families. The remainder are with other key individuals within the U.S. government. So according to Foley Foundation's database, there are currently 46 U.S. nationals held hostage or wrongfully detained across 16 countries. 78% of those are wrongful detentions, while the remaining 22% are hostage or unacknowledged detainee cases. The average duration of captivity across all 46 is a little over 5 years, with 6 cases enduring over 11 years, underscoring the prolonged nature of these unjust detentions. While we have seen historic levels of U.S. nationals wrongfully detained by foreign governments over the past decade, peaking in 2022, there has been a continued decline of wrongful detentions over the past 2 years. Since the peak in 2022, there has been a 42% decrease in the number of U.S. nationals wrongfully held. This decline is a result of 41 releases of wrongful detainees since 2022. In addition to the wrongful detainees, 14 U.S. nationals have been released or rescued from captivity during that same, U.S. hostages, I should say, have been rescued during that same time frame, bringing that total to 55. However, overall, since the start of the Biden administration, 64 of hostages and wrongfully detained U.S. nationals have been released or rescued from captivity. But we cannot forget that there's still 64 Americans that are still being held. So looking over time, the history of wrongful detentions, China, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia have been predominantly over the past 10 years been taking the majority of Americans. So a quick overview of what it has looked like over the past couple of years. In China, U.S. nationals continue to endure lengthy detentions in Chinese prisons, averaging 12 and a half years, with individuals' detentions spanning approximately 8 to 18 years. In Iran, the number of U.S. nationals wrongfully detained has declined significantly due to the recent releases that occurred in September of last year. However, according to the Foley Foundation, there's still another U.S. national who remains held. In Russia, Russia has shown an increasing pattern of wrongfully detaining and holding U.S. nationals. Between 2007 and 2021, the average number of U.S. nationals detained in Russia, wrongfully detained, was 3. However, from 2022 to 2024, this average increased to 9 individuals per year, representing a 200% increase over the past 2 years. Venezuela has had a long history of wrongfully detaining U.S. nationals dating back to 2013. Between 2013 and 16, the average number was 1.5 U.S. nationals per year. Since 2016, that number increased to 9. And that's representing a 500% increase of U.S. nationals detained in Venezuela. However, due to the releases in December of 23, there are currently no public cases of U.S. nationals held in Venezuela. Since 2023, 13 U.S. nationals have been taken hostage. The groups responsible for kidnappings were Hamas and the Taliban. In total, 6 hostages have been released by Hamas, JNIM, and Taliban through negotiations involving the United States, third parties, and other private efforts. The current hostage and unacknowledged detainee cases, specifically in Gaza and Afghanistan, highlight the growing reliance on diplomatic engagements, especially in situations where foreign governments take the lead on hostage cases, or when a U.S. government does not recognize the government holding the American and/or engage directly, therefore utilizing their protective power for engagements. With the ongoing conflict in Gaza and instances where U.S. nationals are held by foreign governments without official acknowledgement, families are increasingly becoming more dependent on diplomatic efforts involving the United States and third-party nations, in addition to the intelligence-driven and military efforts to bring them home. Additional findings from this year's Bring American Home report highlights the growing need for returned hostages and wrongful detainees reintegration support. Several returnees face substantial physical, financial, mental health challenges for years. Many participants shared their struggles securing dental and health insurance coverage due to not being able to obtain a job. And this is challenging to overcome after surviving torture and the other heinous acts performed against them and being held in unimaginable conditions simply because they're Americans. It is clear that more needs to be done to reconstruct and reimagine the United States reintegration support structure for returned hostages and wrongful detainees. Additionally, we need to allocate resources to provide the comprehensive support that addresses their unique challenges and needs. Another finding in this year's report is that we need to establish and allocate a congressional budget line to the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. Currently, there is none. Additionally, rotating leadership and relocating the cell to a neutral area close to Washington has been a reoccurring finding over the past 6 years. Detainee participants demand more clarity regarding the opaque process that culminates in a decision made by the Secretary of State of whether or not they received the wrongful detention determination. Several participants expressed a lot of frustration over the lack of transparency in these decisions, citing that due to the totality of circumstances, we are not designating your loved one as a wrongful detainee. Family members said that they presented credible evidence showing that their loved ones were innocent, their detentions were politically motivated, they were targeted for being Americans, they lacked due process or a fair trial, and required diplomatic engagements for their release. All of this is criteria described in the Levinson Act. So obtaining a wrongful detention determination is pivotal because it not only impacts the level and type of support the U.S. government provides families, but it also legitimizes the unlawfulness and wrongfulness of their loved one's case. Addressing these disparities is critical to ensuring that all affected individuals receive the necessary support and prioritization of their loved one's case. The final finding I will mention, and there are several more in the report, is that the United States must hold countries or individuals responsible for kidnapping and wrongfully detaining U.S. nationals abroad, and that granting impunity in such cases undermines justice, encourages future wrongful detentions and hostage taking, and jeopardizes the safety and security of U.S. nationals traveling abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks for the foundation for Cindy's great report and for holding this event, and also Kane Institute. I have a lot of questions about your report. The post-its indicate there's some questions about. One thing I thought was really interesting, it's a question first for you, Cindy, and then for Dustin. When people are determined to be wrongfully detained, it's usually countries that are rivals of the United States: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. In your report, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, which I think is fascinating, because we know that there are American citizens who are being held indefinitely, under no charges at all, in Saudi Arabia. I'll give you an example. The Al-Jabri family, whose father was an intelligence official in Saudi Arabia, both of his kids have been held indefinitely for many years now. I think they were taken when they were 17 and 18. They seem to be wrongfully detained, yet Saudi Arabia is at least a nominal ally of the United States. So in your report, Cindy, which particular American citizens were you referring to when you said that Saudi Arabia was wrongfully detaining Americans?
Such a great question. And it's important to note that we're seeing this trend not only in Saudi Arabia, but we'll see cases not being designated in other friendly, more allied type countries with the United States, which begs the question of what is going on behind the scenes in the determination process. And and for the cases that you're mentioning, there's a long list of individuals in Saudi Arabia that are being held for the fact that they tweeted. Here in the United States, there's even a UK citizen that's being held in Saudi Arabia for liking or following a specific person on Twitter. So there's a number of these cases where they're tweeting here in the United States and the authorities don't approve of it and they get detained while visiting family, which is a normal a trend that happens throughout a wrongful detention. So the question is why aren't we making these wrongful detention determinations? Is it gonna add conflict or kind of constrain what our foreign policy is with that country? And just to remind everybody, the only person that has the authority to make the determination is the Secretary of State. So you have a lot of competing priorities within the State Department of what's happening. So is national security important? Absolutely. However, this shouldn't prevent families from getting the type of support that they need because their loved ones are being held, and by law, by the Levinson Act, they should have the determination. So what can we do within the State Department in our favor, to still help these families and still, focus on the prioritization of our national security issues? And where do we need to expand? Do we need more resources to this Special Presidential Envoy's Office for Hostage Affairs? Does Consular Affairs need to expand in places where we can continue to support these families? But what's happening, these families are left on the sidelines with no answers, and it's not acceptable.
Well, Dustin, I didn't want to put you on the spot because I know, as Cindy points out, the Secretary of State has to make this determination. So I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which is, there is another layer to this which is very interesting, which is the question of exit bans. So you're not in prison, but you can't leave the country. And in China, in Saudi Arabia, people are subjected to these exit bans and they're sort of effectively put under house arrest. It's not a wrongful detention in the sense that they're jailed. But is this an issue that you are beginning to consider?
Yeah, I think this is really the evolution of, this enterprise in Portuguese. Back in 2014, 2015, we looked at it, this was traditionally a hostage problem, terrorist groups taking Americans. I think what we've seen the evolution to sort of the here and now is this increase in, wrongful detention when state actors are detaining our Americans. I think we're increasingly seeing countries use the exit ban as a tool just short of wrongful detention, but to still try to achieve their objectives. So as a department, as an interagency, that's an area that we're really focused on looking on. How do we address that? How do we sort of, again, make sure that proper resources, engagement are afforded on those cases? Obviously government is extremely large and can be bureaucratic at times. So is that catching up, and is that process being developed as quickly as we would like? No, but it is an issue that we are having.
Jonathan, tell us about your son, Sagi. What is he like?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Foley Foundation, the Kane Institute, for hosting all of us, and to keep up the good fight. Can get, as I'm sure everyone would agree, very lonely as the parent of, as a family member of a hostage, and these sorts of efforts are more important than you can believe. So thank you. So he is my 35-year-old little guy, a father of 3 little girls, one of whom he has not met. I'll give you, she was born 2 months after the massacre on Kibbutz Nir Oz. I'll give you just a few quick numbers, really. On October 7th, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad descended on our kibbutz and other border communities in Israel, massacred what now to be known nearly 1,500 people, 50 of them on my small kibbutz community. 79 hostages were taken. 35 remain of the kibbutz Nir Oz hostages. We know for sure that nearly half of them have already been murdered, 7 since they were taken captive. So we know for sure that in these past 292 days, I believe, there have been more deaths, murders actually at the hands of Hamas, or through friendly fire amongst the hostages. Saeed is a U.S. citizen, obviously, as am I, is a builder and a creator. He has worked for most of his career in a transnational Jewish nonprofit organization, creating social justice projects throughout Israel that serve Jewish and Bedouin communities in the south of the country. Our nation, our world would be much better served by he and all of the 120 hostages who still remain. I come here representing, getting back to numbers, 120 total Israeli hostages, dozens of whom are already confirmed dead. 35 of those hostages, as I said, are from my kibbutz, and a total of 8 U.S. hostages are still being held, 3 of whom are confirmed dead, of those 8 Americans. Time is clearly running out, and I'm in town this week, as it turns out. I'm honored to be at this event, but to make life as difficult as possible for our Prime Minister, Netanyahu, while he is in town.
Well, he's going to be speaking to you in this building today. So what do you anticipate him saying, and what's your assessment of what he's done so far?
It's hard to know what he will say. I would imagine, as far as the hostages are concerned, 120, he will obfuscate as much as possible what his actual intentions are in terms of completing this hostage deal. You don't have to take my word for it. Rather, it's clear that at this point, he and his government are not working or are not prioritizing the fate of any of the hostages, rather their own political survival in Israel.
Is that because of the finance minister and the national security advisor and the coalition he needs to keep together? Is it as simple as that?
It's a bit more complicated than that, but in general, as long as this war continues, this madness continues, because obviously, in addition to our 120 hostages whose fate is unknown, we have the many, many hundreds of thousands, millions actually, of the citizens of Gaza who in many respects are just as much captive of Hamas as our loved ones. And it is our defense officials and intelligence officials, including our own Minister of Defense, have declared that the circumstances have ripened so that an agreement could be reached between Israel and, sorry if I offend anyone, Satan that is embodied in Hamas, to end this madness. And our Prime Minister and his government are now delaying in ways that endanger the lives of the hostages for sure, add nothing to the national security interests of Israel, and perpetuate the suffering of millions.
President Biden, at the end of April, gave a speech, as you know well, in which he talked about a 3-part deal. The first part would be 6 weeks with the release of X number of hostages to TBD, probably mostly women and not members of the Israeli military, children, people who are wounded, the elderly, leading to a second phase, which could go further than 6 weeks if there were real negotiations to release everybody, and then the third phase of rebuilding Gaza. That seemed like a very promising plan, the best plan on the table. You've obviously criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu for not sort of following through. Is he solely to blame? I mean, what role does Hamas play in all this? What role do, obviously there are a lot of, this is one of the most complicated negotiations imaginable, because you have Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you mentioned, you have Qatar, you have Israel, you have Egypt, you have the United States. There are multiple players for any deal. So how do you assess responsibility for the fact that this very promising deal just seems to have gone nowhere.
Well, I mean, I suppose there's a pre-existing question embedded within your question, or statement really, and which is Hamas could have ended this yesterday or today simply by releasing the 120 hostages. Israeli public opinion would not allow our government to continue in this fight. Unfortunately, that isn't going to happen, meaning Hamas unilaterally releasing our hostages. Without the pressure from the US government, back in November, the first hostage deal, which released a little over 100 women and children, would not have been reached. This deal that the president announced in late May, I believe, would also not have happened without a, as I think he self-described it, as a come to Jesus conversation with our prime minister. I think the US is all in. I think that it's taken some time and, for better or worse, additional military pressure on Hamas to bring them to a point at which they are willing to negotiate seriously for the end of the end of the conflict. And right now it's about hammering details out, which demands from both leaders, meaning Yahya Sinwar on the Hamas side, or his surrogates, and our own government, to show their own people in the world that they have the political will and courage to get to yes and to end this nightmare for Israel and, of course, the Palestinians in Gaza.
Let me ask Dustin a question then related, obviously not about the current state of the negotiations, but something that was already passed that you might be able to comment on. So Judith and Natalie Renan of Chicago were released, American citizens. They were the first people that were released by Hamas. Was this sort of a proof of concept to you and your colleagues that the channel between Qatar, the political wing of Hamas in Qatar, and the military wing in Gaza, give us an assessment of what you concluded from that first release?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a proof of concept, and particularly in the early days. I mean, it's rare that we're able to make progress on cases so quick to get some people back. So I think that's something that we wanted to run with, and I think is everybody in this room has seen, when you have Secretary Blinken, the Director of CIA, and Jake Sullivan so personally invested and engaged in a matter like this, and again, engaging with the Qataris, the Egyptians, to try to bring something together. I think that really does show how the United States views the current structure and how this can work. I think, as was just talked about, we're in a very unique set of circumstances here and now that we are cautiously optimistic that we can make progress and get another deal going. But at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, and there's a lot of political decisions that have to be made. But again, we are hopeful that we can get some more releases here shortly.
Pavel, can you tell us about your wife?
First of all, thank you for having me here. And many thanks to Diane and to the Foley Foundation. Diane has been an enormous source of inspiration for me and my family. If you haven't read American Mother, please do. And even though Jim Foley's story is so different from ours, I think the book just captures the emotions that we go through every day so accurately. It's a mix of love and despair, hope and frustration. And when I see Diane, I know that she's one of the very few people who actually understand me. So thank you for having me here. Just 2 days ago, this Monday, we learned from a news report that Russia held a secret trial and found al-Sud guilty of spreading falsehoods by the Russian army. To this date, I still don't understand what it is that the Russian government considers to be false in the reporting. Russia has not provided any public evidence to support those claims. I know that al-Sud is innocent. Al-Sud, who worked as a journalist for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, never produced or disseminated any false information about anything. But her trial was covered in secrecy. much that the Russian government is embarrassed. The case is probably very weak, but we know very little about these proceedings. But what I know is that I have two young daughters who miss their mother very much. Today is day 281 of Alsu's wrongful detention by Russia, and we have been without Alsu for more than a year, 14 months to be exact. It has been a very difficult year for us as a family, but we know that Alsu has done nothing wrong. The U.S. government knows she has done nothing wrong, and the world knows that too. We want her back, and we will get her back. And she will return to the free world. I'm sure she will receive a hero's welcome for this ordeal. But her captors will forever bear the shame of having tormented an innocent woman. I'm certain of that. And I'm certain that they will one day be held accountable.
And that brings me to the question of accountability, which seems to be very rare in many of these cases. In the case of Jim's case, there were two members of ISIS who were, you know, because you met with them and were at the trial. They were extradited to the United States and held accountable for the murder of your son and others. Why is accountability so relatively rare? What can be done about it? And obviously, if it's a terrorist group, somebody can be targeted in a drone strike. This happened with one of the ISIS kidnappers of your son. They can be extradited to the United States. But if they are members of another government, that may be even harder to do for all sorts of reasons. So the issue of accountability, how would you, is there more accountability now than there was in the past, or is it sort of the same? What can be done to improve this issue?
I thank you for that question, Peter, because accountability is essential. And actually, the accountability of those two British jihadists was very rare because we often are not able to achieve that. Partly because we're talking about foreign governments or terrorist groups who are outside of our government, outside of our jurisdiction. So we as a nation, and to me, internationally, I really think Western allies need to collectively work on deterrence, and part of that is accountability. But it's difficult, and I really think we need to stand together as nations, Western nations, because we need to work and look for creative ways to make it hurt to take people and use them as political pawns. The horrific things that Hamas, that Russia, China are doing to target innocent people to use as political pawns are horrific human rights abuses. And but I really feel that we need to come together to achieve it, because it is incredibly difficult because of lack of jurisdiction, a lack of resolve. It often takes many years. I mean, even achieving accountability with Cody and Al-Sheikh took 8 years, and a lot of work with the UK and other governments to make that happen, and our FBI. So very, very difficult to achieve, but necessary, absolutely necessary. It's one of our huge challenges for sure.
Justin, a question for you. How do you, there are dual nationals who may want to go home to their mother's funeral in Iran, or there are Americans who work for NGOs who have been held in Afghanistan by the Taliban. There are journalists just doing their jobs in Russia, like Evan and Alsu. So there are legitimate reasons that some people need to be in countries where this is an issue. There are also people who just go to these countries because they aren't informed or they're dumb or whatever. What can the US government do, or what can social, let's say, I'm thinking about Google Flights. I mean, a lot of people, when they're exploring going somewhere, they look at Google Flights first. I mean, shouldn't there be a warning on Google Flights? I know the State Department is warning about not going to Russia and not going to Afghanistan, but shouldn't there be a way that ordinary consumers should immediately be warned that, this is going to St. Petersburg on a family vacation is probably a dumb idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to give a lot of credit to our consular counterparts in the department, I mean, the creation of the D indicator is just another tool to try to inform. And to Diane's part, to Diane's point, is one of the things that we're looking at is how do we get better at the deterrence, but within that is, how do we get better at the prevention? And from our perspective, if you have a blue passport and you're going to countries like Iran, Russia, Afghanistan, yes, I mean, no matter if you're a dual citizen or just a traditional American citizen, you are at risk. I think, to be blunt, not everyone before they travel is going to look at the State Department website. So one of the things that within our sort of deterrence and prevention efforts that we are exploring and sort of going full speed ahead at is how do we partner better with private industry to make this threat more widely known? And the reports that we've done for years and years, this is another great mechanism, but how do we get that word out? At the end of the day, this is still a relatively small enterprise, but this is an important issue that needs to be known by everyone. So again, whether it's with Google, some of these private travel companies, Expedia, et cetera, like how, when you're going to purchase a ticket, is that sort of risk and warning put right in front of you?
And as, without getting into specific companies necessarily, but I mean, are they kind of, do they get it when you sort of talk to them about these issues?
Absolutely, and I think it's one of the things that, within the SPIA office that we've really seen a lot of traction of over the past few years is the amount of outside companies and industries that are interested in learning more about the space. One, because obviously, businesses have folks that travel anywhere. They don't want their employees to be at risk. But then also wanting to sort of join the broader enterprise and getting the word out.
The headline from the report, Cindy, is this 42% decrease in the number of Americans being held unjustly since the peak in 2002. What do you sort of ascribe that to? I mean, other than the brilliant work of Dustin and Robert Parsons and others, I mean, what's happening here?
Well, since 2022, there have been 41 releases, which is a significant decline, right? But behind that is mechanisms that are getting these Americans out. I do have some statistics I'm going to look down so I don't mess them up. Forgive me. But since 2022, 47% resulted in prisoner swaps, 14% resulted from some sort of monetary exchange, 10% were based on humanitarian gesture, and 2% were rescued. And the details on the remaining are unknown. So almost half are a result of a prisoner swap. And I know it's too soon to say, but at the same time, we haven't seen a sharp increase in cases in Iran. And back in January 2016, when 5 were released, 5 were picked up that year, -1, which is an outstanding case, and that person still is being held today. But what's also happening is that about 85% of these cases since 2022 were resulted directly from diplomatic engagements, and about half of those also included a third-party engagement as well. So the bulk of these cases, so 8.5 out of 10 people need the support of the U.S. government to get their loved ones out, to move forward and to be able to bring resolution to their case. Well, yes, there are still other means. There have been rescues. There have been other third parties acting independently, and those have been successful. But when you look at the data, those cases occurred mostly in countries where before the invasion in Ukraine, speaking of Russia, and in other countries where our foreign policy and our relationship isn't as tense, if you will.
Dustin, economists talk about moral hazard, which is the idea that you can encourage behavior that isn't particularly good, by doing certain things. And so, you know, you must consider this a lot in the work you do in your office, but if you're doing prisoner swaps for Russian spies in the United States or elsewhere, which is Putin's kind of clear goal. I mean, he comes as a former KGB officer. He, in his view, really wants to leave no spy behind if they're his spies. And that seems to be his main motivation. Is there a perverse incentive in giving up a Victor Boot for a Brittany Griner or others? And how do you clearly think about this, but how do you, well, A, how do you think about this, and B, what can you do about it, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, obviously, there's a lot of thinking and discussion that goes into when we have to make these tough decisions. But I think maybe to kind of flip the question is how we look at it and see how is what's the moral hazard of not doing something. At the end of the day, our job is to bring Americans home, and that's our sole focus. So the moral hazard of not doing that means that families are not reunited with their loved ones. So that aside, you know, one, full credit to the president. He has made some very tough decisions, and as you can imagine, the interagency discussions that occur about how to sort of stave off the risk of sending back, you know, a Victor Boot or an Alex Saab. But I think where it really becomes incumbent upon us within the department is that deterrent piece that Diane talked about before, is incorporating that into our strategies, having the specific tools that we can sort of deploy the minute that we have to make one of these tough decisions to bring somebody home, so that, again, it disincentivizes from sort of, you know, restocking the pond, to sort of use a little term there. But I think to Cindy's point as well is, in a way, we've constantly heard that, you know, when you trade a Victor Boot, all of a sudden you're just going to see continued stacking. Where I think when you look at the statistics that we have today, we've not seen that sharp increase that some might have expected.
As far as I can tell, Victor Boot is just running for a local political office somewhere in the middle of Russia and hasn't returned to his previous job as an arms dealer.
I can say I have not thought about Victor Boot since we sent him back, and you know, if he's doing well in life, great for him. But the fact that Brittany's back home, and the fact that Trevor's back home with Yaroshenko going back, that's what we really care about.
What tools does for you, Dustin? What tools do a determination of a wrongful detention give you that you wouldn't have otherwise?
I think first and foremost, it's that ability for not honestly just the department, but the U.S. government as a whole to sort of really engage and advocate for someone's release. I think the second big piece that we have is that family engagement support. Is, you know, families are going through honestly the toughest experience that they've ever gone through, and to have our office, the resources, the mental support that we're able to provide to engage with those families is kind of a key part, so that we can start to partner with that family to figure out how we bring to resolution. I think on the back end of it too, you know, once that wrongful detention determination is sort of comes through, it's, you know, what tools within the government do we have that are sort of unlocked to help solve the case. And I think on the back end, again, the deterrent piece of this, you know, the Levinson Act and the executive order gave us the ability to use sanctions against individuals and entities that are involved in this practice. So that's something that we're weaving into sort of our engagements as well.
Cindy, you mentioned that the process for this determination of wrongful detention, which gives officials like Dustin and others additional tools to really advocate and engage with the host nation who is detaining these Americans. Why are there disagreements about who is wrongfully detained and who is not wrongfully detained? Why is the process, in your words, opaque? And you know, do you have any suggestions about how it might be improved based on your discussions with people who feel that their loved one is wrongfully detained, but the State Department isn't making that designation?
Right, this is $1 million question. What is happening? And, you know, with some of these families, one of the things that I suggest for family members that don't have the wrongful detention determination is to request, you know, when you're working with consular affairs, make sure you have your weekly meetings. They do have a job to bring in information on your loved one's well-being. You ask questions and say, hey, well, when's the last time they had a physical checkup? They should be able to go and bring that information. In addition to that, you should be asking the State Department and folks within Consular Affairs, hey, can you declassify this? You always have that right to say, is there information I don't know, and what can be declassified? And one of the things that came out of our hostage policy change in 2015 is a position over at ODNI, and it's an issue manager, and it's their job in the national intelligence to be able to say, to declassify information not only for hostages, but also for wrongful detainees. So you do have tools. The problem is families don't know what those tools are. And the other problem is without the designation, the families do not have access to the SPHA's office. And that's where it's an opaque, and they don't understand, not only is it opaque when you're wanting to deal with an office that knows how to advocate for your loved one, and can be able to ask specific questions, why were they held? How long have they been held for? What we want to make sure and oversee and make sure that they're getting a fair trial, etc.
But obviously, there is a judgment call here. Tons of Americans get arrested overseas for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but it's a very large number. Many of them rightly so, right? I mean,
3,000 to 5,000 a year.
3,000 to 5,000 a year. So, I mean, can you give us an example of where if the family feels that there is a real reason for a wrongful detention label, and somehow the state doesn't feel that that's the case?
What the data says, and this is the trend that you do see, are American citizens will be dual citizens where they are being held in a foreign country for like domestic political issues, right? So the United States, if this person is, I'm gonna go run against Putin, right? And they detain that individual. The United States, I have not seen for anybody being a political prisoner has called that individual wrongful detainee. And we've seen that across the board. So that begs the question, so is the United States are they posturing themselves to not get engaged in that domestic electoral issue, which we know can spiral, and it's about perception. However, these individuals are still being held, and we need to make room within our government, within our standards, and make space so we can help these families that are suffering.
Pavel?
Yeah, I have a couple of words to say on that. I took note of what Dustin was saying about engaging and advocating about family engagement and support and partnering families, unlocking resources in order to resolve the case. So because Alsu is not designated, we're not getting any of that. Alsu is in prison in Russia because of her work for a news organization funded by this august body right here. And yet the Biden administration doesn't believe her to be wrongfully detained. It makes no sense to me. I will say though that my goal is to bring Alsu back with or without the designation. Not to, I want her to reunite with her children. I'm sitting here right now. I'm not after a bureaucratic government designation. However, that being said, it's important for us. And that would send an important signal to all journalists, American journalists working overseas and risking their lives sometimes. If you are an American journalist detained by a hostile government in the line of duty for your work as a journalist, you should immediately be designated as wrongfully detained. And I support the National Press Club's initiative to secure an amendment to the Levinson Act, specifically for journalists.
Yeah, because by definition, journalists are going to put, in general, news is happening in countries where there may be hostile governments or rivals, or, journalists are not reporting in great numbers unless they're financial journalists in Switzerland. If you're a conflict journalist or reporting on news, you may be in a situation where it's dangerous in one way or another. And that, I think the same can be said for aid workers. By definition, aid workers are not going to be in countries where everything is fine. So would you also advocate the same amendment to the Levinson Act for people who are working for aid organizations.
I'm just speaking here on behalf of my wife.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that sounds good too, but,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, my goal is to bring also veterans from it.
Diane, question for you. So Cindy pointed out that, I mean, this totally absurd thing where, you're held hostage and then you have this huge tax bill when you get home. I'm glad that there is legislation to kind of ameliorate that, even if it hasn't passed yet. And Cindy also mentioned other challenges like healthcare and obviously getting a job. And what is being done right now when hostages return home to help them and their families, and what should be done in addition if there's other things that should be done?
Well, the reintegration process is difficult. As a matter of fact, I forgot to mention that Jeffrey Woodkey did all he could to get here. He was held hostage in Mali and Niger and Africa for 6 long years, tortured, finally freed. So wanted to talk about his struggles in PTSD and struggle with the torture and reintegration. The problem is there is a lot, if you've been designated by SPIHA or, have that designation, you get really good support, or at least a good beginning. But then those who don't have that support don't, in fact, don't often have access. So we have a long ways to go in terms of, I feel as a nation, even though we've come a long ways in 10 years since our son was abandoned essentially by our government, we have a long ways to go. And to me, a lot of it has to do with the will of our nation to prioritize the return of our people. Our journalists, be they journalists or humanitarian workers or businessmen, whatever takes them abroad or family. We need to, our nations have to prioritize the return of our innocent citizens. And I think we're getting there, we're working towards it, but that's why we do the report every year, because every year we see new challenges, people returning and finding out they're in debt to our government, to the IRS or whatever, or can't get their job back, can't get. So, but our first priority always is to bring our people home. And one of the issues that is very problematic, even though, again, that is being worked on very hard, is this wonderful wrongful detention criteria that is set forth in the Levinson Act. But it isn't always applied. We don't know how it's being applied in many cases because it's all classified, very opaque for NGOs like us, opaque for families. We can't figure out why Sue hasn't been designated as the wrongful detainee that she is in Russia. We suspect there's some reasons. But it is concerning because therefore Pavel and his family cannot get that support from that our government is offering through the SPIHA.
Without getting into the specifics of Al Sue's situation, Dustin, if somebody is a dual national, does that have any bearing on the decision to make a wrongful detention determination?
It does not. Dual nationals, LPRs, we treated via policy.
Right. Well, I'd like to open it up to any questions from the audience. So if you have a question for a specific person, can you just say that you're addressing it to a specific person?
If there's anything that shouldn't be politicized, it's technology. And generally, I don't think it is, but what safeguards are in place or should be in place to prevent this from being politicized and consistency between administration? No matter what happens, we're going to have a new president in January. What's in place?
Can I try and offer an answer just as a sort of interested spectator? Look, Roger Carstens, who runs the office and is Dustin's boss, was appointed by President Trump. I mean, how many relatively senior U.S. officials can you think who were held over by the Biden administration and the Trump administration? It's very small. So I think, I'll let Dustin chime in, but I mean, this is a very non-political issue in the U.S. government.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, definitely a non-political issue in to Peter's point, Roger, when it was held over, I spanned administrations in my position at the White House. I worked with the Trump administration, I carried over to the Biden administration, and continue to do this. So from my inside point of view is, while maybe the ways that each administration tries to resolve these cases is a bit different, the commitment is absolutely still there. And I think the importance of the 2020 Levinson Act to sort of really solidify the organizations and structures that were born out of PPD 30 was an incredibly important step to make sure that no matter sort of what the political party of the day is sort of, in the administration, this effort will continue.
Just as a note for the audience, I'm going to try and repeat the questions, so particularly for those who are on the live stream, they can understand what is being asked. The last question was around how do you prevent hostage taking, and that's what the panel addressed.
Hi, my name is Netta Shargi. I am the sister of Emma Shargi, who was detained wrongfully in Iran for 5.5 years, and we are one of the success stories. My brother was returned thanks to the Biden administration and everyone who helped us in this passage. My question is for Dustin and for Cindy. This wrongful designation and the decision whether to designate or not, is the discussion behind the scenes ever whether designating someone wrongfully on the table actually make it harder for them to come home or not? Does that go into the calculation?
No, I mean, it's a fact-based process is really what it comes down to. It, obviously whether it's from our embassies and posts sort of around the globe, they're reviewing those thousands of arrest cases at any point, whether it's family members, outside organizations that are bringing information in. We're taking that, we're sort of then smashing in, I'll say, for lack of a better term, some of our own information, whether it's intelligence or law enforcement channels, to really understand that whole picture of what a case is. Then we'll obviously work through the very bureaucratic process and ultimately get to to the secretary for a decision. But internally, do we have our own discussions and opinion sessions of whether it helps or hurts? Absolutely, but it does not feed into the actual process.
Sorry, just to quickly repeat the question. So it was around whether or not is consideration taken into whether or not a designation helps or hurts, prior to making that determination process. That was the question that was addressed. So, sorry, if you could just pause slightly so I can repeat the question for those who are on the live stream. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Cindy, can I follow up with you? Do you think there are cases in which
There's
wrongful
even
designation
cases with
is wrong?
Roger's title. If you have a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs when the country doesn't even recognize that they're even holding a hostage, right there, that creates difficulties. So we have to be savvy on how we respond, right? Because we're dealing with tough actors. But at the same time, I think this points to the heart of what I'm trying to get at this year in this year's report is, if we privately designate these cases, great, but let the families have the support that they need and have the tools and the wonderful office that Dustin's in to have these great advocates navigating these situations. So, we can't base everything off of a technicality, I would hope. But at the same time, we need to make space for families to be able to receive the support they need.
So in order to have effective advocacy, you need to have some clarity on the facts, and I think this report, Cindy, that you put together, I think is so important to building that base. And off of that, I was curious from your perspective, where do you see some of the gaps in research right now that if we fill some of those gaps will help not only on kind of the big picture international politics scale, but also at the at the family level, knowing how we can best serve those individuals who are going through this. So where are those biggest research gaps?
So the question, just for everyone, is basically where are there gaps in research that would inform the larger issue?
The first topic of many that comes to mind is deterrence. And there is a Canadian coalition that are focusing on arbitrary detentions, and there are, I believe, the last I checked was 76 signatures, which is great. But here, let me just give an example. Here in the United States, we define a hostage versus a wrongful detainee separately, right? The families all see them as hostages. I personally see everybody's, if you're being held against your will for some sort of form of concessions, etc., right? You're being held hostage. However, the US government responds very differently to a wrongful detention versus a hostage taking. You have a counterterrorism response for hostage taking versus more of a diplomatic engagement, right? And a lot of those, and what we're seeing today, specifically with their challenges in Afghanistan as well as in Gaza, where those need to marry together. But my point is, when it comes to deterrence, you have these multilateral responses, having cohesive language is important. What is the definition? Like that's just a simple thing, just so all the countries can get on board to be able to support, right? That's one aspect of it. But at the same time, are we looking at laws? Like right now, it's not illegal to detain an American citizen overseas. So able to enact and be able to open up a case, a law has to be broken. It's illegal to kidnap an American. You have the full force of the U.S., of the FBI and everybody behind that to start, trying to recover that hostage. So that's just one area that definitely needs a deep look into is deterrence.
Hi, my name's Liam Scott. I'm a reporter with Voice of America. My question's for Mr. Stewart. I was wondering if you could provide any updates on the State Department's process for determining whether Alsu Kermasheva is wrongfully detained, and could clarify if there's any difference between her case, for instance, and Evan Gershkovich, who was declared wrongfully detained within 2 weeks of his arrest, and if there are any other updates you can share on U.S. efforts to secure her release now that she's been convicted on obviously bogus charges and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison.
I think first on the process, I'll just say, it's ongoing. Obviously can't get into any specifics here. I think the biggest thing that, in terms of her recent sentencing is, I think we all heard the president, she should be released. And I think, that's coming from the top of our government, and I think as that trickled down, we would agree.
So the question, just for clarification, was around the status of Alsu Kermasheva's detention, wrongful or not, in terms of whether or not that designation could be reached and when it might be reached, and then a comparison between how quickly Gershkovich's designation was achieved within 2 weeks.
Another question?
I have another question. My name is Christina with VOA again for State Department as well. How often is the Secretary of State updated on wrongfully detained Americans abroad? Is this something that comes regularly in meetings with him? Is this we're just wondering about like the process of determining wrongfully detained.
So the question is just how often the Secretary of State is updated about cases that might lead to wrongful detainee designations.
Constantly. Our office is constantly in contact with his staff. Roger Carstens is in constant contact with the secretary. Obviously, even when he's out, around doing his visits around the globe, we are still making sure that he and his staff are updated on where things stand, where things are going, decisions that need to be made. So this is something that's at the forefront of the secretary. I mean, I believe it was the first 2 or 3 weeks that he took the position. He had a call with all the families of the wrongfully detained and hostages, and pledged his commitment to bringing them home. And that's something that we have seen consistently and persistently every single day that we show up to work.
Please. To colleagues of VOA. What's important to us as a family, in the wake of Alsu's secret trial, was to hear from the U.S. government, and we did, that Washington will not recognize this verdict. These spurious charges will not stand here in the United States. She will be exonerated. She will not have a criminal record. This is very important for us, for Alsu and for her family. We will still work on the designation issue, but I will say it again. Our goal is to bring Alsu back, not to get rid of the designation. And I do appreciate all the efforts that the U.S. government has exerted for this cause. I will also say that, to a previous question, that we have bipartisan support for the free LC clause here in the bill. There's no lack of support here on the legislative side. Both sides of the aisle, the Republicans and Democrats, there's no division. Russia likes to exploit any division here in the United States for its own gains. But I will tell you, there is no such division when it comes to securing the release of all Americans held unjustly abroad.
Any other?
Just quickly about moral hazard and deterrence. Just wanted to highlight what Dustin said about flipping the moral hazard question. And Ned, I think at our event and another event said that we shouldn't build deterrence on our loved ones back. And I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And it reminds me like the Persians, futility, jeopardy, and thesis and social change. So I wanted to highlight that, and if you want to speak more, Peter, I know you wrote a big paper about this, and highlight that piece, which I think is still part of the thing. And then sanctions, Cindy, my understanding is that under 14708, there's been one in April last year. They've done sanctions under that, but I don't know if under the Levinson Act there's been any sanctions. I don't know if you have any evidence of that or if there's on that specific part of the experiment.
Okay, so two-part question. The first one was around essentially the moral hazard concept and how do you move in parallel? How do you bring people home at the same time? You're also working on deterrence, and is there a view within the government that there's a conflict, or is there no conflict between those two things? So let's start with the first part of that question. I also want to just thank Jonathan Demershine, who's having to move to another event. We thank you for your time here, Jonathan. We're looking forward to the day when Siggy is back with you and your family. I think that was directed to Dustin.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I can talk, I mean, I'll just start. So on the sanctions piece and the Levinson Act sanctions in particular, we levied them against Russia, Iran, and Jordan. Now, I will say, look, the reality is the majority of the countries that we are dealing with, I mean, if there is someone that's still left in that country that isn't sanctioned, I would actually be surprised. So we kind of view our use of tools a little bit different. Is first and foremost, when we look at it, is it going to help someone who is detained get out? And that's one of the initial questions that we ask ourselves. The second question, which kind of parallels with that, is using this sanction tool going to hurt in getting someone out? So it is something we wrestle with. It could be sort of the tool of choice, and we could do this in every single case. But one, is it going to impact in a positive way getting someone out? And two, how does that play into that specific deterrence strategy that we're implementing for whether it's that specific country or group? So yes, while we've not used it as frequently as many would like, there's a rhyme and reason behind that.
Did you want to add that?
One thing that I'd like to add, you can overly sanction individuals. I mean, if you look at the individuals that are sanctioned from JNIM, they're already SDs, especially designated global terrorists, or they have multiple, and same thing with the cases in Russia and Iran. They have multiple sanctions from the U.S. government against them. So to Dustin's point, is it going to help, right? What could help is knowing how to, if we can remove those sanctions. I know, for example, Andrew Brunson's case, he was held in Turkey during the Trump administration. There was a lot behind the scenes, but at the same time, we removed a sanction before his release. So can we utilize these sanctions as tools to be able to be able to get people out?
In the absence of any other questions, we'll wrap up. I want to thank Cindy, Pavel, Jonathan, who just left, Diane, and Dustin for their time today, and thank you to the audience for attending.
Thank you. I've got a couple of closing remarks as well, but please, let's thank the panelists. So I'm Benjamin Gray with the Foley Foundation. As we close today, I just wanted to speak to our panelists, also thank them directly Pavel, we look forward to the day when Alsu is released and her freedom is secured. Thank you for telling her story. Thank you for telling the story of your family. We need her back now and not tomorrow. We'll continue to support you as long as it takes. Just a quick note to Jeff Woodkey, if you happen to be catching this on a recording or live streamed, he made every effort to be here but got caught in the snarl of air traffic control over the past week. He got as far as Chicago but could not get all the way here. So we appreciate his tremendous efforts to try to be here with us. Dustin, thank you to your team who work constantly, day in and day out, to support those who are wrongfully detained and their families. It's a hard job. Cindy, thank you for your research, which has had a tremendous impact on this community, always helping us to see that next step ahead in the path. We appreciate you. Going forward, the Foley Foundation will continue to engage policymakers within the executive branch and legislators with the recommendations contained in this report. These recommendations are based on the lived experience of returned captives, hostage families, and third-party experts, as well as government officials. We will be in listening mode and eager for your feedback. Naturally, we'll retain our independence and push back when necessary on behalf of the families, but no one is interested in recommendations that are unworkable. So together, let's make these recommendations work for the victims to ensure that there are fewer and fewer victims going forward. We are grateful for the partnership of everyone who has made the success we've seen as a nation over the last 10 years possible. That success since Jim Foley was murdered almost 10 years ago. We thank our fellow NGO partners in this community who together do work that we cannot do alone. The multitude of civil servants across many agencies who work these cases each and every day. The elected officials who champion the issue. The journalists who continue to highlight this national security crisis, particularly the victims' stories. And we admire the passion of the families who spend every waking moment to secure their loved ones' freedom in every possible way. You inspire and challenge us to keep up that work every day. This work takes place in the open in events like today and in demonstrations, but it also happens behind closed doors in quiet strategy sessions. It is difficult and in difficult negotiations with unsavory counterparts. It's grueling, it's frustrating. This work is interspersed with moments of great joy and moments of deep sorrow. But we must deal with the world as it is. We cannot look away from the ongoing tragedies endured by dozens of families every day, inflicted by those who would terrorize to instill fear, and by authoritarians who use people as commodities to show strength and to attempt to gain what they could not through legitimate means. We must bring our citizens home, and we must also deter and prevent hostage taking. We must do both, and we must do both simultaneously. Caring and defending innocence and standing up to evil are the utmost demonstration of the values of our country. This is not the time to let up. It's the time to make hostage taking unacceptable, impractical, and not worth the cost. Thank you for all coming today and joining us online. This concludes our event.